Hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We have Kieran here with us today. We're going to be diving into episode 4 of our Figma series. Today we're going to be learning about layout grids and constraints, something that I'm not actually too familiar with, so I'm definitely going to be taking away a lot of lessons from this. Kieran has so graciously thrown some links, helpful links, in the chat box. So feel free to check those out. These are basically things that are going to be involved with today's presentation. Really quickly, I am Emily. I'm the community manager for Designlab, and we have Kieran here. He's one of our awesome mentors. But yeah, I'm going to let him take it away. Hello, thank you. Yeah, say hi in the chat. Let us know where you're from. Yeah, we just love to know where everyone's from, especially when you're joining our webinars. And if you do have questions, please throw them in the questions tab. And then when we reach the end of the presentation, we'll go through some of those questions. But hopefully, Kieran, with his very detailed presentation, will likely answer a lot of those. But cool. Take it away, Kieran.
Perfect. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us. If you're new here, my name's Kieran. I do have the very, very, very top of the chat. There's a link to my portfolio just so you can sort of get to know me a little bit more. But if you've been here before, welcome back. It's good to have you. There's also a few other links that I'll be going through today up at the very top as well, which if you click on those, they'll go into the Figma files that you can then download from the community page that we'll be going through. So let's get started as we always do by, let me start by screen sharing. And let's go and share my entire screen. All right. So as I mentioned, my portfolio is in there as well. So if you want to get to know me a little bit more, I am a huge nerd, and it's good to meet fellow nerds out there. So yeah, say hi. As I mentioned as well, there's also bits and pieces that we'll be going through, which are in the community page. So if you haven't been to the community page before, if you go into your Figma, your main page of Figma, on the left-hand side here, there is now a new community tab. It's been out on beta for a while, but it's recently been given out to everybody, which is great. And so the two links are to Heaps Good Layouts, which is what I'm going to be going through today. And the other one is Heaps Good Icons. So we've got those two there. So both of those are available for you to duplicate and use in your own Figma file, your Figma account that we can go through today. So let's begin. So the very first thing that we need to look at is when we're looking at layout grids and constraints, I think the easier of the two to start to get your head around is probably constraints. And there's a few things to note here. That the first thing to note, and I've got these over to the right-hand side. So if I'm going too fast, you can always come back and look at these. If you have a look at that, every element has constraints. So as soon as you create an element, you'll notice that over on the right-hand side in the properties panel, there's this thing called constraints. And what it does is, by default, when you create a new element, it always does it from the top left. And what does that do? Well, the main thing it does is, as I stretch this out, as I stretch the frame that it's inside of, it stays the same. It stays in the exact same place because it's constrained to the top and left. So as you can imagine, if I have different properties for that, it's going to behave differently as I stretch it. So this is a question that I commonly get when, for whatever reason, a student in the Slack is stretching their artboard or their frame, and it is stretching the rest of their content as well, and they're not quite sure why. And 99.9999% of the time, it's because there's constraints associated to them. And they're constraints that they didn't really expect. So that's always the first thing to look at, is if you're trying to resize any of your frames and they're doing something weird, it's probably because constraints are involved, and you need to look at those first. So let's have a look at a few examples. And of course, by no means is this an extensive list, because there's only 3 of them. But these are some pretty like normal ones that you're going to run into throughout your life. So center. So inside of this, in your constraints, you can change from left to right, to left and right, to center, and to scale. And that works for both of those. Top and bottom, center and scale as well. And when you go to use those, you can either use them as a drop down, as you just sort of saw, or you can actually click on the little sort of like guide that you get here as well. If you want to do both top and bottom, all you have to do is hold down the shift key to do that as well. And then same as left and right, I want to do that. And then it'll always be associated to left and right and top and bottom, right? So what you'll notice is that it's 120 pixels away from the top and left. And no matter what I do as I resize it, it's always going to say that 120 pixels from the top and left. And as you can sort of see, it's actually changing from there. And you might be like, yeah, of course, that's exactly what I'd expect it to do, right? Yeah, that's what you would expect it to do. But where does that come from? Well, it's because it's constrained to the top and left. Then let's look at something a little bit more fancy, like a center and center. So let's stretch that out and see what happens. So what's happening right now is if I click into the image is actually staying the same size throughout, but it's actually centering it both horizontally and vertically throughout the stretching process. So no matter how much I stretch it, it's going to stay in the same place, and it's not going to deform the actual original element there, right? So that's really helpful for things where you're trying to set it up and you always want it to be in the middle, and you don't want anything to be messed around. Set it to 480 and reset that back. And then we've got scale. So as you may have figured out, scale is going to scale the layer that's in there. So as I like move this around, you can sort of see that it gets scaled down. It starts to get a little bit smaller and smaller and smaller as I go down, right? And what's sort of happening here is that it's staying a percentage away at this point now. So you might be wondering, like, as I move this in, why is this getting skinnier on the left-hand side and right-hand side? Well, the reason is because it's staying the same percentage away from the middle point, right? So that is actually scaling, and then the gap between it is also scaling. So as you can sort of see, even though we started off with 120 pixels away, as I move this in, it then starts to get smaller and smaller as you go in. So it's no longer 120 on the left and right now, it's 80 pixels. So so it not only scales the layer, but it also scales the original element there, but it also scales the spacing in between. So again, that's what you might expect from something to scale down. But yeah, if for whatever reason you're trying to, this is a very common thing when I find a lot of my students are trying to resize their icons and it's inside of a frame. They're trying to resize it, but it stays the same sort of size. So they're sitting here with something that is top and left, and they're trying to resize it down, holding down shift to try and keep it like the same way all the way down, but it's just staying there. It's not moving. And it's just because of those constraints. So that's why constraints are super powerful, and they can help you manipulate items on your document. So let's go back over to the tips and see if we've missed anything. So we've got every element has constraints. Constraints are based on frames and layout grids. So we'll get into layout grids and what they are in just a minute. But as you can sort of see, if I've got this element here, it's constraining it to the nearest frame. So you can tell like what is a frame versus a group. So let's do the same sort of thing, but let's turn this into a group. And you'll notice that it snaps into itself. And you'll notice as well that there is no longer any constraints, right? Because there is no frame. There's no way to constrain it to anything anymore. So it only works with frames, not groups. So that's a very big thing. And because a component is a special type of frame, it will work within a component as well. So if you have anything that is set to a component, that will work. All right. There are a lot of different options, as we sort of mentioned. So get practicing, like see what they do, like just play around with it, because it's good to sort of like experiment and understand what the tool does. It's very similar to like the Boolean operations tool of like union and like subtract and all that kind of stuff. You want to like play around with it and see what they actually do. Because sometimes it's better to just find that out for yourself rather than me theoretically telling you. It's good to get into the practice mode and do it yourself. The default is always top and left. So whenever you create something new, so if I create another rectangle, create another rectangle, create another rectangle, as you can sort of see, every single time it's top and left. Even if it's like really close to this side, for example, it's still top and left. So as I stretch that out, it always stays top and left, all of those items. But if we were to duplicate an element, you also bring along the constraints of the properties, the constraint properties, I should say. So what I mean by that is if I decide to say, oh, you know what, I want this to be like, I want him to sort of like have a little bit of a little platform to stand on, right? And I always want it to be to the bottom, and then let's do that. Let's delete those guys there. If I want that to always be at the bottom there, all I have to do is then set that to the bottom. And now if I stretch that, it'll be to the left and to the bottom, right? And then if I happen to duplicate that and then make it a little bit smaller over to the right-hand side, you'll see, so I just hit Command D to do that. So having that there made it a little bit easier for me to always have that ready to go, and it's right there with me as I duplicate it. So obviously it also works if I hold down Option and move it over, or if I copy and paste it, or whatever the method is to duplicate. It's not just a special thing because I hit Command D, right? And of course, it also works if I copied and pasted it outside of this frame to another frame. So if I like copied and pasted this one over to here or something like that, or copied and pasted and then moved that over there, it's always going to be to its frame, right? And it's going to keep those constraints there. So left and bottom. So no matter what I do, as I stretch it, it'll stay left and bottom always. Awesome. So that's about it for constraints right now. Obviously, there's a lot more to deal with once we get into layout grids and how they interact with layout grids. But yeah, let's jump over to layout grids and see what they're all about. And of course, if you still have questions about this, like ask it in the chat there, or not in the chat, sorry, in the questions tab, and we'll get to it at the end of it. All right, so let's go into layout grids. So this is a very, 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 very common question that I get of like, what the heck are layout grids and how do I use them? And not only that, like, what are the best practices for layouts? Like what do you recommend for like margins and gutter widths and all that kind of stuff? And the answer is it depends. And if you're like my students, you think I'm the "it depends" guy. That's my kind of catchphrase, but it truly does. So in this case, you've got material design, and as you can sort of see down the bottom here, there's a link to the actual like guidelines. I've just taken a screenshot, so you know that I'm not just pulling that out. That is like based on the breakpoints. So where they sort of like say, from this size of a device to this size of a device, how many columns and margins and gutters, like what specific details that they all need. So in this case, at 359 pixels, you should have 4 columns, and then 16 pixels for the gutters in between, and then 16 for the margins on the left hand side and right hand side. So before we dive into any more of that, like, what are layout grids? Well, layout grids essentially allow you to design anything on your, again, using frames, design anything on your frame to be snapped and to be aligned to the grid, right? So why is this helpful? Why would you want to do that? Well, the main thing is when you're going from desktop to tablet to mobile, or mobile to tablet to desktop, you're going to have a lot of things that move around when you resize it, right? And what we want to be able to do is set some rules so that as we resize it from something that is 375 wide all the way up to 1920 by 1080 wide, like, we want to make sure that everything fits appropriately and it looks right for the device. So for something that is in your hand and really close to your face versus something that is like your desktop and that's a little bit further away from what you would have as your face. All of those different things have different metrics to then sort of say, this is how much space you should be putting into your designs. And so the very next question is, like, what are the settings? Like, what should you have? So let's go to our good friends over at Airbnb, because this is, I'll copy and paste this into Chrome and chuck that here. So I'm going to the Australian one, of course, but you can go to any one of them and you might get a slightly different experience. That's perfectly fine. It's not so much what we're looking at. What we're trying to look at here is, as we resize it, so as I pull this sort of stuff in, we can sort of see some stuff starts to move, and we can also see some things like stay the same as I push it in. So as you can sort of see here, I'm stretching this from left to right, and what's happening here as well is that some things like stay perfectly aligned on the left, and some things stay perfectly on the right. And then as I squeeze them in, you'll see that some things shift around, some things stay perfectly aligned all the way through. And then at some point, there is what's called a break point, and that will change the layout of the design in some sort of fashion. In this case, what it's done is it's just stretched the height of the image to the viewport in this case. So as you go along, you can also see that the search input also changes, and you keep going down and it's changed again. So all that is to say is that when you're doing this, and you can also see like at a certain point, there is like a nav menu that comes up down the bottom there. So you go to explore, saved, and log in down the bottom there. And then you can also see that these 3 columns at some point break, and then they become more of a carousel. So it's at the same point that happens at this point, and you can sort of see that it breaks into less of like a 3-column layout and more of like a carousel that you can swipe through. So as you can sort of see here, if I I can't swipe on here because it's not touch, but if I was using a touch device, I'd be able to do that. I think it doesn't want me to do that right now, but that's all right. So you can sort of see a few other things like change there as well, and you start to get a little bit more of a different layout going through that. So how do we make sure that it works no matter what we're looking at, desktop, tablet, or mobile? And this is how layout grids help us. So it keeps everything fluid so that you're not making everything just like, oh, willy-nilly, like I just want to like chuck this item here or put this button here and hope for the best, right? Your developer is not going to like you very much at all. So by doing this, you're actually setting up some rules for yourself to adhere to, and start setting that up. All right. So in the Figma file, I've actually set up a few different things based on what material design has said. So material design has said a few different things. So from 0 to 599, so that's the width of the viewport. The viewport being the frame in this case, but it's often the device, or sometimes it's the browser. So as you can sort of see here, this is a 1920 by 1080 screen. But as I sort of like scroll in, right, like the overall screen doesn't change, but the window does, like the available space does. So the viewport is now smaller. So yes, it is for a lot of things the size of the device, but often it's the size of the window that's currently active. So yeah, so that's what the viewport is. So when you sort of like go through all of this and you see, okay, well, there's a lot of like similarities. So if I go through here, you can sort of see all of these are all the same. So if I change that to red and change that to like 10% or whatever, those are all the same there. That's different there. So we've done a separate one. So 600 to 719, we've done a separate one. And then this one here is separate again. So this is our large tablet. So 720 to 839. And then we also have all of these, which are also all the same there. So that's sort of how I've broken that down. 4 separate points here. And then we've gotten 4 separate things. So what do these do? Well, the main thing that they do is as you stretch, what happens is that they stretch with you, right? So these are flexible guides that come with you as you do it. So as you put in elements, so let's just put a rectangle in, right? You can sort of see that everything sort of like snaps to these points throughout. So you might be wondering, okay, well, that's all cool and all, but how do I actually create these? Well, it's actually quite easy. So if you grab a frame, right, any frame at all, doesn't matter. Like I said, it only works on frames and components, of course, because as I mentioned, components are a type of frame. They're just a fancy type of frame. It doesn't work on groups, unfortunately. It doesn't work on a specific, like a rectangle, for example, even though they may look the same. This versus this frame, you can't set a layout grid for that. But what you can do is set a layout grid for this one here because it's a frame. So over on the right-hand side, you'll see that the option is now available to you. And you can click on this little plus, and by default, it will give you a grid layout grid, which is kind of annoying because I never use them. So it's a pretty annoying default, but that's perfectly fine. We can deal with that. And what it does is it defaults to 10 pixels. So why is this handy? Well, maybe you're doing like an icon set and you need to set this up, and you may want to use this as a way to quickly draw up a grid. The main thing here is that as I sort of like resize things, it snaps to these like 10 pixel things, as well as I draw. It tries to keep it as best as I possibly can within those 10 pixel grid there. All right. So it's not really useful that much in UI design, I've found. Like you can use them, but for me, like I don't use them. I find them kind of useless in this kind of context. But nevertheless, they're there if you need them. So let's change it from a layout grid to a layout grid column and a layout grid row and see how those change. If you have a look at that, let's go to columns. So by default, what happens is it sets the count to 5. So it's now created 5 columns. It's given it a color of red at 10% opacity. That's neither here nor there. You can change that to whatever. Like it really doesn't matter. It's just more so that it differentiates itself from the rest of your design. So if you have if you're doing like McDonald's or KFC or something like that, maybe having red guides isn't the best because everything else on your page is red, and it's going to be very hard to see what's going on there. So whatever you're doing, it's just set as a default because most sites don't use red all that often. It's very easy to see. You'll also see that it's sometimes set to yellow or green or like some really putrid color like that, that like you hardly ever use in design. So in UI design, anyway. So that's the kinds of colors that you can like choose. Of course, you can choose whatever color, like I mentioned, but you may have blue or purple as like one of your primary colors, and therefore it gets lost a bit in translation. So default red. Let's just keep it red for now. And then we have so obviously we can change the count. You can set it to auto. We can set it to 1 to 12. You can set it to 200 if you really want to. They just give you 12 as like a normal number to play around with at the start. And then we can also set this to be stretched. So what that means is as I stretch this out, it will keep the same like gutter widths. So the space in between the columns, it'll keep that the same, and it'll stretch the width of the actual columns there. So let's go back into those things. So that's what stretch does. You also have left. So as you can imagine, what happens there is that it gets stuck to the left. And then what also happens is that it unlocks the width property for columns. Obviously, you can also do right. And then as you may have figured out, it sticks to the right. And then we can also set it to center, right? And yep, your smart cookies out there, it's going to stay at the center. But most of the time I use stretch for most of my designs. And what you'll notice is because I've set it to stretch, it's actually grayed out the width property. So you no longer have access to that so that it stays stretchable. And then margin. So what is margin? Margin is the on the outside of left and right, outside of the actual layout. And what that allows us to do is if I set this to, I don't know, 20 to be the same as the gutter, it just adds 20 on the left-hand side and right-hand side. I mean, like I mentioned, you can set it to like whatever you want. And then as you stretch it, it'll always be 60 pixels away, and all the gutters in between will be also that 20 pixels. So, and then like I mentioned, 20, you can manipulate the gutter there as well. So when you're going to create this yourself, what you'll sort of see is that columns and margins and gutters are all there. Again, this is just a guideline. You don't have to use this. A lot of people go, oh, like it was in material design, I have to use it. This is just a sensible default, right? So if your website calls for like more like less dense information, so I always bring this up of like the difference between like a museum, like an art gallery, versus like a banking app or like something that's like super serious where you need to cram in a whole lot of information. You're going to have like different vibes between the two, right? One is going to be a lot more spacious and a lot more sort of like this is like open, and I can see all the imagery, the typography is large, therefore the spacing is also large. And then the other one is going to be like, I need to fit as much numbers as I can. I want to show as much information to the user as I possibly can. So the goals of the design are different. And because of that, your breakpoints don't change, but well, I mean, they might, because you might be targeting different devices. Like you may be targeting like a kiosk inside of the museum rather than like a device, like a mobile device. So that becomes more of a standalone thing. Anyway, that it doesn't become about the breakpoints. It becomes about like what is the best practice for the columns and the margins and gutters for that specific reason, for that specific company. So that's why I said it depends. right? So so it's not just like it depends and deal with it. It depends because of that variable of like trying to be as inclusive with your design as possible and trying to fit your layout to match the vibe, the feeling that you want to have from it. So as you go through it, like you can sort of see that it goes from 0 to 599, and we can sort of like stretch that around and do all that kind of stuff, like for all of these, right? So what you'll notice is as I stretch this out, this will keep going like forever and a day. Like if you have like an absolutely massive monitor, you can keep going there. But let's just set it to 1440, which is like a pretty standard like laptop. And then, yeah, we can do it from there. Another thing that I often get asked is like, what about fixed layouts? So as you sort of saw in the Airbnb, let's go back to Chrome here. What you sort of saw here is that there is a breaking point where certain things like stay a certain size. And they don't grow any larger than what's currently there. So if I bring this back down here and I keep stretching this out, there is a point at which that this Airbnb like thing doesn't actually grow any like wider than it currently is. So there is an absolute maximum. And in this case, I know it's 1600 because I've measured it, but you can measure it by hitting Command Control Shift 4. I know that's a crazy combination, but if you do that and you do like a weird claw, you can like find that for yourself. And what I sort of do is I then just measure it across, and then I can sort of see that it's roughly like 1600. I might have been off by 1 pixel on the other side. So that allows us to sort of like see what they've set as the maximum width for that. So when I go to do it over here, like that's what I'm trying to then do is like set up my designs to match like whatever I'm trying to do. The other thing with Airbnb is that they're notoriously change their layout from page to page, which is another big question that I get is like, should I keep the same layout every single page? Well, as you can sort of see, we have a full width design. So this is going, so this piece of white is going all the way to the left, all the way to the right. And then we also have an image going all the way to the left and all the way to the right. But then behind it, we then have a secondary sort of grid that then allows us to snap to that like part there. So what we sort of end up happening is that we go through this, and then there's actually like a rectangle behind everything that is then set to like some sort of color, right? Let's go like green or whatever. And that, like, as I sort of like stretch that out, if I set the constraints appropriately, I set it left and right there. As I sort of stretch this out, we have something that is going to stay no matter what you do. And then we have like a layout grid we can manipulate inside of there. So that's kind of like what's happening with this here is as I'm stretching this in and out, there's this is obviously to a lot larger of an extreme, right? Because I'm stretching it really far out, but it's sort of like going to about there-ish. And as I sort of like do that, I can sort of like say, okay, there is a maximum point that we get to, and we can deal with that. And then as I sort of like squeeze in, there's like different things that then snap to do other things. And that's where I would go to a different breakpoint and describe what goes on there. So yeah, so that's what Fix does. So it's a layout that stays centered within a fluid thing. So if you want more information about all of that kind of stuff, I do definitely recommend looking at the material design layout guidelines there, linked below, and that will definitely help you out figure out when you would use one versus the other. And let's also have a quick look at other pages on Airbnb, because I think this is always a good place to start, is to look at the real world and actually see what is happening in there. So let's go to, I don't know, where are we going? Okay, let's go to Tokyo, right? And we'll go to Japan, and we'll be super optimistic, and we'll say October 1st to the 8th, and I'm going to say 2 adults, 1 child, and go from there, right? So what you'll notice now is the design has completely changed, for one, but we've also changed the layout of the whole thing. So instead of being, let's open that back up. So airbnb.com.au. So what you can sort of see here is even like the more simple things like the logo are all the way to the left-hand side now. So right now they're inside of a container and they're like fixed. And then as soon as I come to this one, it's all the way to the left now. Obviously, there's a little bit of a margin here, but it's all the way to the left and all the way to the right. And then as I sort of like stretch this in and out, we also have the same sort of thing going on with the actual design here. So there's some cool stuff that we can do to mimic this using both constraints and layout grids to help us out. But yeah, that's something to keep in mind. And not only that, when you go from home page to a search results page to a very specific listing page, we go through different designs again. So now we're on a different layout altogether. So there are some things that stay the same from the homepage to the homepage to the profile page, right? So we still have the icon on the top left, the search in the middle, and we have like the extra menu stuff on the right hand side, right? That's always there no matter what we do. But the way that it's stretched out is dependent on the actual content below and how we do that. If we were to take this exact same thing and stretch it all the way to the left and all the way to the right, well, it might look a little bit weird, and we might need to add a few more images to make it worthwhile, right? It'd make the text illegible at that point, because your text would be going from all the way to from this side all the way to about here, or maybe even over here, because this would be over here, right? So each line would be about this sort of long. So that would be a little bit intense to try and read that going from one side to the other of the screen. So yeah, there are like usability reasons for layout grids as well. All right, so now that we've got all of that, now let's actually put those two concepts together. Well, actually, let's just quickly check that I haven't forgotten anything in the tips here. So you can have both fluid and fixed layouts in your designs. Oh, there's a bit of a spelling mistake there. You can have both fluid and fixed layouts in your design. So as I mentioned, it doesn't have to be the same thing all the way down the page. You can break that out and of course have it different for each page on your website. There is going to be a point where it can be a little bit topsy-turvy. So make sure that you're not just changing the layout grid just for funsies. You're actually thinking about like, what is the purpose of this page? The purpose of this page is to do X. Okay, what's the best way for me to do X? So in the case of, again, Airbnb, the whole purpose of this page is to obviously make you want to look at this and go, yes, I want to stay in this place, right? And then if I hit reserve, that is going to take me there. So as I sort of like scroll down, this stays with me. So this layout lends itself to this kind of 3/5, 2/5 kind of layout that allows me to have this kind of like design that always sticks to the right hand side there. Whereas this one here perfectly is suited for looking at all the different things in the map, as well as being able to equally see what's going on here. And then on this page, it's a lot more big and in your face, and we want you to sort of like feel like you're about to go on holiday and go there. So each of these have different goals and therefore different designs to meet those goals. So don't get too stuck in your lane thinking that you need to always have the exact same layout grid every single time. Yes, it is preferred, But if you have a good reason to do it, then yeah, go for it. Talk to your developer, have a conversation about it. All right, let's go back into Figma. So there are defaults that you can use, for example, Material Design and Bootstrap and plenty of others. So in this case, I'm using Material Design. But they are just that, the defaults, meaning that they can be changed. So don't get that tunnel vision and think that, oh, because Material Design has done it, that's how I have to do it every single time. There are those different things of going through and saying, okay, well, this makes sense for my design. This doesn't make sense for my design. What should I do? Layout grids can have styles. So this is something that we didn't touch on, but layout grids can have styles. So as I go through it, as I create a layout grid, all I have to do is, let's just create another one over here. So this one here, I'm going to just detach. So if I create this as a grid style, I can hit the little plus there. I can hit the little plus there, and I can change this to Kieran's cool grid, and then say create style. And that's going to be my grid that I use throughout. Why would you set this as a style? Well, the cool thing about this is if you do a whole bunch of like desktop screens, which you will in your lifetime, and you decide, well, now I've actually done all the designs that I need to do. I just want to quickly see what they look like without without it. So if you go into your settings there, and then you turn off the eye there, you'll notice that it also like gets rid of all of those there. So it makes it really, really easy for you to quickly turn on and off your column grid guides or your row grid guides to do that really quickly. The other thing that I didn't go through is rows. It works exactly the same as columns. You just have rows versus columns. Like it's literally the same thing. It's just, yeah, going down the page rather than across. So let's turn that back on and have a look over there. So they're associated to frames, just like constraints, and you can nest layout grids to make some really complex designs. So I'm going to show you how I would do that in the next thing, which is putting it all together. So let's jump over to here. So this is a design that I put together like really quickly. Nothing too fancy. I just have like some buttons and some input text and some like iPhone stuff here as well. So here's one without any like grids associated to it. So as I stretch this out, there's nothing nothing that really works there. But if I stretch this, you'll notice that everything sort of stays in the right place. That's because all of these have their constraints associated to them. So this really, really helps with staying left and centered. This one's staying is center, and then this one is staying right and center. And I've included this in here so you can play around with it. You can manipulate it and see what happens when you change the designs, and you can sort of like see what's going on. So whereas here, I've actually taken the time to then make it so that you can stretch this to fit. Obviously, there is a breakpoint at some point where you want to, like maybe at the 599, like we have in the material design, where it starts to get a little bit weird and a little bit cheesy, and you're sort of like, that input's starting to look a little bit weird. We need to change that. So that's when you might snap into another design at that point. But yeah, so if we sort of like go through that, and let's try and make this design into this one here. So what would we do? So the first thing that we would do is obviously resize it back to the original state. So let's undo a few more times. And as I mentioned, like because they're in styles that I've set up in the document, I can go to my layout grid and I can click this little 4-dot menu and then change it to the 0 to 599 one, because that's exactly what we have, right? And what you'll sort of see is nothing's changed except that there's a grid now, right? Whoop-de-doo. So now the next thing to go through is go through each of these elements and associate the constraint to either the frame or to the layout grid. So as I mentioned in the previous one, that constraints are based on frames and layout grids. So it will go to the nearest frame, like the outer frame, or it will go to the nearest layout grid that you have set. So let's go back to that, and I'll show you what I mean. So in this case, what happens is that as I stretch this out, like nothing happens because right now it's set to left and top, right? And that's to be expected. But what you'll notice is that there's this blue dotted line that is telling me like what the constraint is. Over on the left-hand side, there doesn't seem to be one, right? And that's not entirely true. There is one, but it's actually locked to the left-hand side of this layout grid. So as I sort of stretch this out and let go of it, you'll see that there actually is another layout grid there. Sorry, a constraint to the layout grid. That's perfect because as I sort of like go beyond that, you then sort of see that it goes to the nearest frame at that point, right? So you can sort of see how this is going to be useful when we go to design everything. So if I then undo to get us back to the normal thing, if I want this to be constrained left and right to this grid here, all I need to do is simply hold down shift and do left and right. And what that'll do now is as I stretch this, because it was closer to the column grid there, to the layout grid for the columns, it will go to that rather than the frame. And that's sort of what I want throughout my design. So as I do that, you can then sort of start to do that for the rest of these. So you can set this up and then stretch it to the other side, or we can just resize it back to normal and then set all of these and hold down shift to do left and right. And then now, as I stretch this out, that will stay left and right. So that's great. So another thing here that we're missing, as I mentioned, you could do it either based on the frame or you can do it based on the layout grid. In this case, we're doing it to the frame because we want it to be all the way to the left-hand side and right-hand side of the frame. So again, shift, hold that down, and then click on the left and right there. So again, just stretch that out and see what happens. Perfect. So far, so good. We've got our title. We've got our different inputs here that are all working. The only thing that's missing is these two here. So what's going on here? So in this case, another question that I get is like, does everything have to be on these column grids, right? And as you can sort of see, or it may be a little bit hard to see on the stream, but as you can sort of see, this is like busting outside of that, right? And that's because it's actually not, they're not two separate elements like unto themselves. They're actually they're actually a grouping of elements. So when we have a grouping of elements, we can actually set that to be part of the layout grid. So this is one single item, this is one single item, this is one single item. And there's no grouping happening across columns, right? So what we can actually do is we can say that these go to the left-hand side and right-hand side of those columns. Whereas these, we want it to be inside of a frame so that it stretches, but it keeps this 12 pixel gap in between rather than the 16 pixel gap. So how would we do that? Well, the cool thing about this is that I've set up the buttons already to be auto layout. So auto layout is a really cool feature that we'll get into a whole nother session later on because it is a bit of a doozy, that one. But it allows me to stretch the content so I can stretch the container of the button to be as wide as I want, or I can get it to snap to the child and be however big the child is. So however long the word is going from there. So as I do that, what you can then sort of start to see is if I put those two together, so I'm going to hit a key combo here. So Command Option G. And what that does is that puts it inside of a frame. So if you think of like Command G as grouping, Command Option G as putting it inside of a frame, it's sort of like an extended frame. So that's why there's like the little option on there. That's the way I remember it anyway. What we can then do inside of this frame is set another layout grid, right? A much less complex layout grid, of course. But what we're going to do is we're going to set it to 2 there. And we might change this to a different color just so we can actually see what the heck's going on. Again, we might go for green and maybe a little bit more opacity, just again, so we can see it a little bit easier. And we can hit X out of that. We're going to keep it to stretch because we obviously want it to be stretchable. And then we also have no margin because we don't want any sort of spacing on the left-hand side and right-hand side. But we do want the gutter to be set to 12, right? And what that'll do is now if I click into this frame, I want this to be stretched to this like right-hand side of this thing here. And then I also want it to be on the same sort of thing as this here as well. So to do both of those, what I need to do is make sure that I'm setting it up in such a way that it makes sense for my designs moving forward. And in this case, what I'm doing is I have like only the left and right. So even if I do stretch this, right, it's still going to do like a crappy thing. It's not going to be doing what I want it to. So if I say stretch left and right, and then maybe I want to center that, and then same sort of thing, left and right, and then center it vertically, then as I stretch this frame, what will happen is that there's always a 12 pixel gap in between. So this is really, really helpful for little things like this. And then what you can then do is you can then set this overall frame to be left and right there as well. So what that means is that as I stretch this whole thing, everything stays the same all the way through. And you can zoom in and you can see that it still stays 12 all the way through. So this really, really helps with your design overall. And then lucky last is then stretching this out and then setting this to left and right. And then I'll also set it to the bottom there. So rather than the top, I'll just set it to bottom. So as I stretch this out, and stretch it beyond what is like usually used for, it'll stay with the bottom of the design. All right. Yeah, so that's how I would recreate this. But as I mentioned, all of that is in the file, so you can play around with it. I've also set up a little demo area for the Airbnb thing, so you can play around with that. Like set up your own constraints and play around with this and try to resize things based on like whatever the design is in Airbnb, and then sort of go, okay, well, how would I make this yellow thing there, and how would I constrain that so that it stretches based on however I move the thing. It's good practice, and it's a good way for you to start putting in those hours. All right. So I think that's pretty much it. If you need any more help with that, let's go over to the questions section, and yeah, let's ask some questions.
Sweet. Oh my gosh. Okay. So the first one we got was from Sarah, and the question is doing left and right and top and bottom the same as center center?
No. So let's do that. So let's use something. So let's create a frame here, and let's create it like 480 by 480. Oh, that is a big number. Delete that there. Let's create a rectangle here, and let's center that and set it to 200. Center. All right. So I just aligned that. I didn't put a constraint on that. So what we have here is we've got left and right. Sorry, left and top. So I'm going to do top and bottom, left and right. And let's also do the same sort of thing here, and then do center and center. So what this allows us to do is what left and right does is, as you can sort of see, everything is 140 pixels away from each other. same thing here, 140 pixels away from each other. The difference here is that what it'll try and do is it will try to resize this based on what's going on, because what it's doing is it's saying, okay, there's no, like, it's like pushing it in. It's like, no, there has to be 140 pixels always. So it's like crushing the square as you're moving it in. Whereas this here is centering it. So this will stay there and it just sort of like floats there. It's sort of like, it's buoyant and it's like happy and it's like, yay. Whereas this one is being slowly crushed to death. Or it can actually grow to be whatever. So depending on what you're after, you may actually want that kind of behavior. So yeah, they are different. And the main difference is that that setting the left, right, top, and bottom is going to keep the same spacing, whereas this will sacrifice the spacing, but it doesn't want to sacrifice the shape. It wants to center the shape as much as it possibly can. So yeah, that's the difference.
Awesome. All right, next question is from Andrew, and question is, so setting the grids correctly along the constraints makes handoff crystal clear or easy enough to do DIY the same way in something like Webflow?
Yeah, so for something like Webflow, like you can use grids, you can use columns inside of Webflow. So for me, like what I like to use is I like to in particular like to use grids in Webflow because it's a little bit easier. I wish Figma had access to grids, because what grids does, like in the CSS naming convention, what a CSS grid is different from a Figma grid. So it's a little bit different, but what it allows you to do is, as you sort of saw, that you could do like you could do columns as a thing, and then you could do rows as a thing. So it would only do one at a time, whereas a grid in CSS allows you to do both at the same time, which is really confusing when you first use it, but it gets easier and easier as time goes on. So in terms of like just using columns, like I wouldn't actually use columns in Webflow. I would actually use grids, and you can set them up to be very similar to columns in Webflow, but that's kind of the difference. But yes, in terms of how it makes it easier to go from design to development and to actually dev the actual design there, yes, it does make it easier, because you're adding that layer of communication of how does this resize and where are the breakpoints. Yeah, unfortunately, it's not all just one giant thing, like one giant canvas that you then say, I have this breakpoint, and this breakpoint, like you do in Webflow. What you have is a whole bunch of different canvases, like frames in this instance inside of Figma, that are all different breakpoints. So you'd have the mobile version, you'd have the tablet version, and then you'd have the desktop version, and those would all be separate frames. Whereas Webflow, it's all the one frame, you just resize it, and then you see like what happens. So yeah, it does help with that communication between the two, definitely.
Sweet. Hopefully that answers Andrew's question. All right, next question is from Ellen. The question is, why did you want the spacing between the buttons to be 12 instead of 16, which was your grid spacing?
Yeah, so the main difference there is that it's the difference between a sibling and like a parent-child relationship. So going back to like the Gestalt principles, things that are related to each other need to be close to each other. Things that are somewhat related to each other need to be close to each other, but not so close to each other that they're like suffocating each other, right? So in the case of like in the case of this, right? What I have here is I have 20 pixels in between all of these items, right? Let's actually just turn off these guides so we can actually see what we're doing. So let's go to settings and let's just turn that off, and then do the same sort of thing. Settings and turn that off. There we go. So this is our design, right? So as you can sort of see, if I like start to hold down the Option key, you can sort of see like the spacing throughout. When I look at this one compared to this one, this is 20 pixels away, 20 pixels away, 20 pixels away, right? So what I'm telling the user very subtly is that these things relate to each other because they're all the same amount of space away from each other. What I'm telling the user is, again, is that this between here and here is different. So treat this differently throughout. But then I'm saying these two should be handled equally in terms of like they have the same amount of power, but one is more a desired outcome, which is save, versus a least desired outcome, which is cancel. So both of these allow me to have, like, if you look at the spacing between all of these, what I'm sort of like saying to the user is that this is what you should be like setting your mind to, is that all of these things are the same as each other. So when I then sort of say, okay, this needs to be 16 and 16, right? If I want to say this is 16 pixels in between, what I'm then saying to the user is that these no longer have the same I guess relationship to each other. They're separate to each other. So for example, if I was to do if like, because you can't really see the layout grid, but I can sort of see it with my with that. So let's go to the settings and let's turn that back on. So not that you would do this. Why isn't that turning back on? Come on, where'd you go? Come on. Okay, it's disappeared on me. That's not fun. I don't know what happened there. So let's say that we have that there as well. And that should be set to, yeah, roughly there-ish, right? And then this should be there, and that should be there. So I'm not sure what's happening with my grids right now. It's not a very opportune time for the grids to stop working right now, but it is what it is. So if I say that this and this are right next to each other and they're 16 pixels away, what I'm sort of like saying to the user is that these are two separate things. These are two separate entities. They shouldn't be set as a sibling to each other. Whereas here I am, because they're a little bit closer. I mean, you could set it to 8 to give it even more of a dynamic sort of like feel. The reason why I set it to 12 is, I think, mainly because I'm used to having a lot more gutter width than 16. I usually set mine to like 20 or 24. Like, I like a little bit more space. I don't like everything to be cramped like it is right now. But that's just me. So maybe in this situation, I'd probably set it to 8 rather than 12. But again, it's up to you how you want to do that. But really, it's just showing the relationship is different between those two items versus like this one up here, going from there. So hopefully that answered your question. I know that was a little bit of a roundabout kind of way of describing it, but really it's about the relationship to each other rather than like, is this two totally separate things?
Almost like visual hierarchy, right? That's essentially what we're going for.
Yeah, I mean, to extend it, like let's say that you were to do it on a desktop, right? And obviously, okay, well, now it's working. I don't know why the grid wasn't working on that frame, but anyway, let's say that to extend it, you would change it to like maybe like an 840 wide, right? And you would change that there. So if we were to move this out, like, if I was to do this, you'd think I was insane, right? Like, you'd be like, what are you doing? Like, you shouldn't be doing that. Like, it would be like associated to maybe like the right-hand side or something like that. But even then, if I was to like, instead of like associating it to this, and let's also Command-Shift-G to move it outside of the Command-Shift-G. There we go. To move it outside of that, if I started to do like this, so in this case, it'd be 3, and then in this case, it'd be 2, right? You'd be looking at me weird. Or even if I did this, like, and and I took off the thing, you'd be looking at me weird, because you'd be like, that doesn't really make sense in that case. Like you're setting it to well, if I actually associate it to the grid there, you'd still be looking at me weird, going like, that doesn't seem right. Because what's actually happening here, if I again turn this off, what's actually happening here is that there's like too much of a space there now that's associated to it, and you're saying that these two things are different from each other. Whereas if I took the same exact thing and again put the columns back on, if I deleted those two, dragged and dropped this in, and then said, oh, you know what, this actually has to go within there to there, right? There's the hierarchy that is saying that, oh, this belongs with that other thing, right? So this is saying, yeah, these two belong with each other now. So it's just it's a little bit more minute of a detail in mobile, but on a desktop, it's much easier to see like what's going on. And what you'll notice is that if I stretch this, it will like stay there. Whereas if I had it on the 20 pixel, it would like do all kinds of like weird stuff, and it would stretch it even wider. And yeah, it's just not the same. So again, hopefully that answers your question. It's a little bit of a hard one to answer, but it's really just about the relationships to each other.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All right, second and last question. This one's from Sanal, and the question is, did we group the footer before stretching?
So if we're talking about this one here, this one already is a component. So this one has a frame associated to it. So as I mentioned, components are a special type of frame, and inside of that, like you might also see, like if I like dive into it, there are some like tabs inside of here that then have a layout grid associated to it. So if you sort of like dive into it, what I then have inside of that is that there is a each of these is then like centered within that. Same as that. That's centered within this box, and then that's centered within that box, centered, 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 all the way through. So yes, there is like a frame within a frame. Then this frame here is then being stretched left and right and constrained left and right to the outer thing, to the outer frame, which is this one here. And then when we go to use it, so that's why when we like use this and we stretch it, it's already being stretched, right? It's already like conforming to that. Whereas if we didn't have all of those things, so if we took off that, you can sort of then see that like it just like centers it, right? It just does whatever it can to deal with that. So, and it doesn't go all the way to the left and all the way to the right there. It just sort of like puts it in the middle and hopes for the best.
I don't know if that's always the best, right? Hoping for the best.
Yeah, just hope for the best. It'll be fine.
All right, so next one is from Patricia, and the question is, any tips or tricks when working with images versus buttons/text boxes when adjusting frame size?
Yeah, so let's go to our good friends over at Unsplash, and let's just bring in an image. So Unsplash, and let's just go, and yeah, let's yeah, okay. Let's get this puppy, right? So let's go copy that, and let's go and add it to our layout grids, and let's add it to maybe one of these pages here. So let's edit that, turn that back on, and let's paste this in. That did not work. Why didn't that work? Copy that image. There we go. And paste this in. All right. So in this case, it works exactly the same, right? So as I resize it, it'll do that because Figma's good like that. And as you can sort of see, it is constraining to the columns here. So as I move this over, it's now going to be constrained to there, and then maybe to the top, and then maybe to the bottom here. And then maybe I want to constrain it to this middle part here. So all in all, like right now it's still like associated to left and right. So as I stretch, nothing's going to happen, but I can then set this to top and bottom, left and right. So as I go along, this will actually now stretch to fit. Right. So it works exactly the same. There's nothing really different there about it. So maybe you have a follow-up question from that. But yeah, it doesn't really change how that works.
Got it. And then we have one last one that trickled in, a follow-up from Sanal, but it might be a little bit more of a general question in relation to everything we learned. But Sanal's asking, so we can use either material design or human interface design.
Yeah, so like even though I was just like designing in iOS, like I was using material design, like the strategy behind material design, because not everything like needs to look exactly like what everybody else is doing. Of course, like there are going to be some defaults there that that look more native to the design in iOS or in Android. So there are going to be some defaults there that make sense. For example, a segmented control or a button or a tab, they both have like totally different looks and vibes on both, both very stylistically different. But what you sort of like have to think about is what makes sense for this, like what makes sense for your brand, what makes sense for your website, for your app, for your service, whatever you're creating. What makes sense for it? Does it make sense to use 100% like what human interface guideline says? Well, human interface guidelines are a lot more loosey-goosey with their rules. They're just sort of like, yeah, just make the website not suck, right? Make the app not suck. Like they're not very like stringent on any sort of like font sizes or colors or anything like that. They just say use good colors, use good contrast, and it's very like very basic. So what you only really get from them is actually a bunch of like controls. So again, if you go into the community section, you can go into like iOS, and I would look at Joey Banks. So Joey Banks actually works on the team at Figma, and give him a follow on community because it's a really he does a whole lot for Mac OS and iOS as well. But if you like open that up, I've already downloaded it a million times, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to open it up here. But if you duplicate that to your account, you can then see how like material design and something like iOS like completely differ. So I've also got the material design baseline design kit. That if you again, if you type in material into community, that's where I got it from, and it's done by the material design team as well. So if I go to material theme and you look at all the different like controls and that kind of stuff, that's all there for you. So if we go through this has all of the different elements, and you can see something like a bottom nav, for example, is different to this kind of bottom nav, right? Stylistically, it's different. Like obviously, it's very much the same, right? Like there's an icon and a word, right? But how you design it is completely different. Like there's like uppercase there. The text is a lot bigger. So in this case, it is actually. Let's go into the settings here. It's 14, and I think in iOS it's like 10, right? Yeah, it's 10. So there's a big like font size difference there, and so on. So there's like a lot of different things that would make that different. So for me, like I would actually go towards material design for the tab design choice, because I find that it's easier to read for a lot more people. And I like the sizing. I like the spaciousness that it has. Whereas I find that what we have here is a little bit cramped, and it's sort of like shoving it in. Yes, it's quite reserved and conservative with space, and that might be the look you're going for, and then go for it. But what I'm going for is more like a little bit more space. Like I just like a little bit more like room to play around with, as much as I possibly can. So and even simple things like a toggle or a slider. Again, if you zoom out a little bit there's like a slider there. I don't know where the toggle went. It's somewhere in here. But you have all of these like different like components that you can then use throughout. Here's the sticker sheet as well. So you can sort of like look through all of these different items, and there's like a checkbox over there. There's all different types. There's chips over on the right-hand side there. There's a whole bunch of buttons, and then selection controls. So we have checkboxes and radios that are essentially toggle switches there, and stylistically they look completely different. So for me, like when you're going to design whatever you're going to design, it is recommended to obviously design for the platform that you're designing on, of course, but there are some things where you can stretch that and you want to like associate it to more of your brand than making sure that you're true to your specific design. So think of like your favorite apps and see how many of those look like default apps. So for example, like the music app or the podcast app or like messages or notes or something like that. Look at those as like the default apps and then compare them to like, for example, like the notes thing, compare that to like Evernote or something similar. For music, like the music app by Apple, look at Spotify, look at SoundCloud, look at other things like that. For the podcast, look at things like Overcast and Castro and a few others. Those different things, if you look at them, some of them are using some like quote unquote like iOS or Android like native things, but a lot of them are taking what they have in the human interface guidelines and running with it and then creating their own thing. So again, it's a good baseline, it's a good default, but it's not it's probably not the best thing to design 100% purely as the design intended there, because otherwise everybody's apps start to look the same and you want to stand out from the crowd. So yes, good to follow good practices, design patterns, so on and so forth, but push yourself and find different ways to solve the same problem.
Absolutely. All right. And then lastly, we just had a request to please do a webinar on voice design.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely something coming up because a lot of my students are actually, one of my students just finished doing one on Alexa and doing Alexa Intense. So that'll be a very interesting one, and using AWS, so Amazon Web Services, to actually program that. And yeah, it's a really fun little thing to play around with, and setting up, because there's a lot of parallels in graphical user interface and voice user interface in terms of how you research for it. But there's a lot of like, as you may have figured, there's a lot of different paths that you could go down. And yeah, it could go in all kinds of different ways. So yeah, I'd love to do one on that eventually.
We'll add it to the list. All right, cool. So that wraps all of our questions up. And thank you everyone so much for being here. Thank you, Kieran, again, for hosting such an amazing webinar. Just to reiterate, this is going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel. I'm throwing the link in the chat, as well as please follow us on Instagram because I am trying to grow our presence there. So, and we do event announcements and stuff there as well. Sometimes it is exclusive to Instagram. So just wanted to put that out there. But again, thank you everyone so much for being here. Really, really happy you're able to join us. And we will have our next episode, which I believe is episode 5, in 2 weeks' time. So keep an eye out for that announcement. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kieran.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Bye.